Hello everyone, welcome to this session. If you have any general questions, you will start by addressing those, and then we can go on to the questions from the forum. Akshat?
I have a question. Uh, when will there be answers for the assignments uploaded?
Sorry, your voice was breaking. Could you repeat that?
I
So
could hear actually, Prakash.
Oh,
So
I see.
it's at
My
your end.
internet is a
So,
bit unstable
his
nowadays.
question was whether any answers of the assignments be uploaded.
It has already been uploaded for, except for the last one, which
okay,
the late late deadline is still due. The other ones, you can find it in the same page where the assignment was given. There's just another PDF file with the solutions. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one general question.
Go ahead.
That is, what is the expected course completion date?
I think it's the first week of April is uh, the last week,
Okay,
and then there might be extra week for submission of the last assignment, perhaps.
okay.
So,
Thank you.
mhm.
Thank
There are 20 lectures, so you can count that.
you. Okay.
Yeah, in the course page, it should also be
Yeah.
there.
The course page, I think the full timetable is there in the course page.
Yeah, I
If not,
think
then
we'll go to the questions
forum
from the forum.
questions. Can can you read them out, Prakash?
Sure. Okay, the first one, there was a question by Abhishek. As seen in cyclotron, the individual harmonics will overlap on each other to make a continuous spectrum, which is maximum at the cyclotron frequency. Does the similar thing happen in synchrotron spectrum too? That is overlap of individual harmonics to form a continuous spectrum, which is maximum at the synchrotron frequency. The other question is also, why does the synchrotron spectrum of ensemble of electrons drop smoothly compared to that of a single electron?
Okay, so both are, your question is correct. Your statement is correct that you have a spectrum peaking at a dominant frequency, and then there are harmonics of it. In case of cyclotron, the dominant frequency is at the gyro frequency, and then higher harmonics, which have lower amplitude, but each of them get a certain width. So now, if it is a pure cyclotron at a near zero beta, then this is mostly dominated by one frequency. That's the gyro frequency. All the higher harmonics are negligible. So you get a monochromatic radiation. As you start speeding the electron up, so you will have beta going up. So each of those harmonics will also acquire a certain width, and there will be more and more harmonics which will come up in amplitude, and you will get a certain progression of harmonics with each of them with a certain width, which will overlap, and you will get a sort of undulating spectrum, right? So peaks at individual harmonics, but it is not zero in between. And the strongest peak at the gyro frequency. So this is what happens at non-relativistic limit. As you go towards highly relativistic limit, when beta is very close to 1 and gamma is much larger than 1, then the dominant frequency shifts to the synchrotron frequency, which is gamma squared times the cyclotron frequency. On the other hand, the gyro frequency goes down to 1 over gamma times the cyclotron frequency. And each of those harmonics again have a certain width and they start overlapping. But now, below this dominant frequency, there are many other frequencies. The dominant frequency is harmonic number gamma cubed. And all the way from 1 to gamma cubed, you have multiple frequencies at the spacing of the gyro frequency. But each of them have considerable width, and they all overlap to give you this nu to the power of 1/3 spectrum below the synchrotron frequency, nu synchrotron, and then sort of a partially exponential kind of cutoff at higher frequencies. But it is a full continuum spectrum described by the combination of modified Bessel functions, as you would find in the literature. Now, when you have an ensemble, each electron produces a distribution of frequencies like this. Now, if all the electrons had the same energy and they were all in the same magnetic field and had the same pitch angle, then they are all producing copies of each other, and they will just add. So you will get a enhancement of this basic shape of modified Bessel functions multiplied by the number of electrons which are radiating. But all electrons do not have the same pitch angle. So if you don't have the same pitch angle, then even at the same magnetic field with the same gamma, your gyro frequency will change, your synchrotron peak frequency will change by sine alpha, and you will get a smearing of this. Any smearing will cause the overall shape to become gentler. So because you're smoothing with something. And then you further consider the fact that all electrons do not have the same energy. So because of a large distribution of energies, so you get a smearing by the energy distribution, the corresponding energy distribution. Each energy will produce its own gyro frequency and synchrotron frequency because they all depend on gamma. So this distribution of gamma will further smoothen it. And as a result, you get a much smoother distribution of spectrum when you consider an ensemble of particles. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, Deepankar, one related question, may I ask?
Yes, please.
Okay, the spectral slope that we see, is it certainly it's a combination of these two things that you just described?
Yes.
But which one is the dominant one? In the sense, is the energy distribution leaves a much more recognizable imprint on the spectral slope, or is it the individual sort of spectral behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. What happens is, in the regular astrophysical situation, it is the energy distribution which leaves a major imprint, because the energy distribution of electrons is much wider than the frequency range of synchrotron peak that is traversed due to the energy distribution of electrons is much larger than the typical width of the synchrotron spectrum of a monoenergetic electron. So as a result, we get a spectrum which is largely shaped by the electron energy distribution. However, if you look at the part of the spectrum which is below the lower cutoff of the energy distribution of the electrons, then that is shaped mainly by the synchrotron, the basic synchrotron function. So nu to the power of 1/3 is what you would see below the synchrotron peak frequency corresponding to the lowest energy electrons. So, and similar thing will happen at the high energy cutoff. So if you take the synchrotron energy corresponding to the highest energy electrons in the distribution, above that, the synchrotron spectrum will fall off like the spectrum of a single particle at the highest energy. But in between, since the energy distribution happens to be quite wide, it is mainly shaped by the energy distribution.
Thanks. So the other way also, one can look at the spectrum and actually try to relate it to the energy spectrum much more confidently than in the central part, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we normally do. It's without explicitly stating all these arguments, we have become used to just inferring electron energy distribution directly from the observed synchrotron spectrum.
Okay.
Okay,
The
next
next
question,
question is from Aniket Prasad. He asks, towards the end of lecture 9, we established that a photon has to travel a much larger distance in order to gain enough magnetic field in a perpendicular direction for pair production. Then what exactly is the expression L? The mean free path of pair production is 2.3 times the critical magnetic field over the perpendicular magnetic field.
Yeah, that is the distance the photon typically will have to travel to create a pair. So you will have an expression which you'll have a value which is B perpendicular in that. So the smaller the B perpendicular, the longer it has to travel. B perpendicular comes in the denominator, right? BQ by P perpendicular. So because the photon is generated moving very close to the current tangent to the magnetic field. So because only because of the curvature of the magnetic field, it will then pick up a certain B perpendicular at a certain distance. And given a B perpendicular, that is the amount of L pair is the amount of distance it has to travel to produce a pair. But the B perpendicular itself now is a function of distance that the photon has traveled from the point of origin. So you need to keep comparing this at every value of B perpendicular and then see whether for that B perpendicular enough length has been traversed. And then you will know whether the photon has traversed enough distance to produce a pair or not.
Aniket, do you have any follow-up?
No, sir, I got it, what you meant from that expression. Thank you so much, sir.
Desh, you want to say something?
Yeah. No. So the role played by the higher order higher poles in the vicinity of the surface must play an extremely important role in providing the future of the pair production, the way it's going to proceed, right? Because there the dipolar field doesn't help much because of the curvature is not enough.
Exactly. So this is why right from Stark onwards, people have considered multiple fields near the surface to give you enough pair production in the inner gap.
So I think a measure of that, in any way that one can get, maybe through the distortions of the polarization curves and so on and so forth, would go a long way in beginning to understand why certain pulsars behave certain ways compared to the others.
I agree. But I think this is a question people are trying to grapple with observationally, and I don't think we have had very clear measurements yet as to what is the geometry as well as magnitude of the multiple fields near the surface. But
there must be estimates, right? I mean, there must be some theoretical predictions of what self-consistent.
So, if you look at Ruderman Sutherland, what they would say is that you need field line curvatures significantly less than 10 to the power of 6 centimeters, right? Maybe 10 to the power of 5 centimeters, between 10 to the power of 5 to 10 to the power of 6 centimeters. So at the polar cap. So even if it is 10 to the power of 6 centimeters, let us say, you cannot do that with a dipole.
Right.
So you will have to go to significantly higher multiples to do that. Quadrupole may also not be enough. So maybe one higher order. So people have not expressed it in terms of which order multiple you need to go to, but they have expressed it in a more business-like fashion as to what radius of curvature you need.
Hmm.
And that happens to be around 10 to the power of 6 centimeters.
Is there any transient action in the lower magnetosphere can produce situations which, produce fields in the slightly different orientations or different types momentarily?
Not to my knowledge from the pulsar magnetosphere, unless there is something else happening from the neutron star itself, which is what happens, for example, in magnetar, or thought to happen in magnetars, that you suddenly get a part of the surface reorienting and the magnetic field getting twisted in a scale which is very small compared to the surface. And that can then release a lot of energy. So that's a possibility, but I don't think in regular pulsars people have invoked that.
So that's like on the sun, for example. I mean,
Yeah.
No, I mean, is there any contribution from the charges and movements in that region which has any recognizable contribution to field?
In the regular magnetospheric solution, the augmentation of the field, which is done due to the currents that is produced by these charges,
Right.
is usually small, and it's in fact it increases as you go further away from the surface.
I see.
So the relative contribution increases further away from the surface. So I think near the surface it might be quite difficult to produce very strongly curved magnetic fields by particle motion.
No, because that's the place where the charges are moving in opposite directions, okay, within the acceleration region.
Yes.
And so it might have some net, which might be for the same number of particles elsewhere, where they're moving together, might have some help.
You can have a current, but the current is in the magnetospheric solution, force-free magnetospheric solutions, you will get current which is roughly of the order of Goldreich-Julian current, right?
Correct.
So you take Goldreich-Julian charge density, the maximum velocity you can move it at is c. So rho gj times c is your current.
Right.
And the magnetic field that will generate out of it is going to add to the local magnetic field. So that is what causes basically the field line, the addition of the toroidal component of the field.
Correct. Yeah,
and the field line sweep back.
Yeah.
So the effect of that near the surface is small, as far as I know.
I see. I mean, within those 15 meters or whatever.
That's right.
I had a slightly related question. So we did discuss how the decay of the magnetic field for a pulsar takes very long time. The time scales are very large. Does that also mean the multipolar field structure near the surface is pretty much what it was as it started out with for the entire age or lifetime of its pulsations?
That's a good question. I mean, this is something that we have investigated some time ago. It depends on where the currents that is driving these multipolar fields are located. If they happen to be in the crust or outer part of the crust, then it might happen that over the lifetime of an active pulsar, you might see some amount of decay of the highest multipoles. But I think that even the lower order multiples survive for quite long, longer than the lifetime of the pulsar.
Okay, so when you said this was investigated theoretically, you mean, right?
Yeah, there is a paper by Dipanjan and me, Dipanjan Mitra and myself,
Okay.
Many years ago.
Okay, I'll take a look. Thanks.
Dipankar, that paper assumed that there is no toroidal component present. So all the multipoles evolve independently,
That is correct.
and so the higher multipoles decay very fast.
Yes.
But that may not be true. If the higher multipoles have to survive, there must be other mechanisms. I mean, toroidal components, etc., have to be present in order for them to survive.
No, they don't. We don't know that they survive. Because those
Yeah,
are higher
yeah.
multiples. We consider up to multiple of 25 and all that. So
Yeah.
I don't think there is any direct observational evidence of such high multiples. But multiples of the order of 4 to 8, we did not see much decay in the active lifetime of a pulsar. So we actually don't know whether the higher multiples of the order of 25 and so on actually are there and whether they survive through the lifetime.
So what about those very slow pulsars where people generally invoke very high multipoles?
Very high, I mean how many? What order?
I mean, see, the paper by Dipanjan and Gill, they invoked
Yes.
extremely large, a very high order of multipole. And so what would happen to those?
Yeah, that depends. As I said, that this result that I referred to is under certain assumptions. Where you locate the currents, what are the local conductivities, and as you also mentioned, whether there is any stabilizing field, whether there is extra helicity which is stabilizing these fields, and so on. So, and we looked at only ohmic processes.
That's right.
So there are other processes which can, for example, a Hall effect can actually go the opposite way. It can take a large scale field and create smaller scale fields. So when you take all those into account, I don't think there is a definitive answer to what you might expect, because it depends on so many assumptions. So one has to turn the problem around. If you do see a certain behavior of multiple components, then you might rule out some of these assumptions and retain some others which are relevant. And that's the only way we can make progress in this. Ab initio, we have no idea what is going on subsurface in the neutron star.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, before going to the next question from the forum, there's one in the chat. Can a pulsar switch spectral index for some pulses from negative to positive? That's from Parul.
Whether this has been seen, I think Desh is better placed to answer this question than I am.
I think it's tied up with the instantaneous spectrum you take, okay, for a given pulse. Many times you are not even sure that you're looking at the same population of particles radiating at those different frequencies when you look at it at one instant as at the observer's point. So you will see wild variations in the spectral index. People, Russians particularly, have done a lot of work on pulse-to-pulse variation of the spectral, spectra, in not just the slope of it. And all kinds of things can be seen in those because you are really comparing apples with oranges at any given instant. So this is the average behavior that will reflect in the, and that is to do with the, the several effects that, that come into play as a function of frequency, in this particular case as a function of height, and so on and so forth. So one has to be careful in interpreting instantaneous spectra. You might see wild variations in them. They might even appear to turn the other way. But it may not be a reflection of the actual description that we gave of how a spectrum is shaped.
Hi. So this is regarding my own data. What I saw was that the pulsar's profile is basically of higher intensity as at the lower frequency as compared to at higher frequency. But for some pulses, the average profile shows a different behavior. That is, it is much less intense at the lower frequency and of very high intensity at the higher frequency. So that's why I was wondering if it's not
so these are average,
instantaneous, but yeah, it's average profile behavior.
so you might, depending on which frequency range you might be looking at, the average spectra pulsars show turnovers at frequencies below, typically 150 or so for most pulsars. So it depends on which part of the things that you are seeing. There will be situations where the lower frequency pulses will be weaker than high frequency.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I should mention that this multipole work that I was just mentioning, Sushan is also an author in it.
Okay, so Vijay, you have a question you want to ask related to these questions?
Okay, go ahead. Next question.
Vijay, your hand is raised.
Sir, actually, they are not related to this question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, sir, the first question is, you mentioned about seeding by cosmic microwave background in the striped wind model. Like CMB is like, it has a very small brightness temperature. So how come it will actually create seeding? It's very low energy, right?
I'm sorry, I got disconnected for a little bit.
Okay.
Can you repeat?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sure. What I was asking is, in the striped wind model, you were we were discussing about the cosmic microwave background acting as seeding for the emission. Like it is very low energy with low brightness temperature and all. How would it create seeding compared to other high energy processes?
Seeding cosmic microwave background, I don't think I ever said that is seeding for pulsar magnetosphere. I think that's too low in energy.
No, striped wind. See, you were referring to CMB. Was CMB's cosmic microwave?
No. Even in striped wind, cosmic X-ray background or gamma ray background photons will help.
Okay.
Not cosmic microwave background.
No, you were referring to CMB in one of the slides. What was that CMB?
I never said cosmic. I'll have to check what that abbreviation you're talking about. But it is not a cosmic microwave background.
Okay. Sir, and the other question is, like you were referring to all sky emission. You were talking about populating the entire sky. Like I didn't quite understand what you mean by populate the entire sky with.
So you have your pulsar and it radiates different amounts of flux in different directions, right?
Yes.
So you start from the pulsar and then see how different parts of the sky are illuminated. All 4 pi solid angle around the pulsar.
Oh, right? So for what is you are taking instantaneously or taking them together?
Taking at any instant, because every other instant is a rotated version of the same, right?
Okay, sir.
So you take at any instant, take a snapshot, and then see how different angles with respect to the pulsar are illuminated. And then you rotate that model, that gives you the full spin period through which how the sky will be illuminated, right?
Okay. Sir, and then
the spin going through spin period is taking this full sky model and then rotating the observer around.
Okay.
So you just get a line of sight cut through this through this pattern.
Okay. So, sir, and this is this is about, we were having some discussion about the mean free path. Like, this is a basic question. Like, is this mean free path the same as in what we have in ideal gas, inversely proportional to the number density? Is it related to that?
Mean free path is not always proportional to number density. It depends on mean free path of what process. But yes, it means the same thing.
Okay.
What is the average length that a participant has to traverse to cause an action?
Okay.
That's what is the mean free path.
Is it?
It could be a photon traversing through magnetic field, causing a pair production, right? So
Yes.
it is not. It does not depend on the number density of anything here. It depends on the magnetic field strength, and it depends on the photon energy.
Energy. It depends upon the energy. Okay,
Yeah.
sir. Okay, sir, and this is again the striped wind. You were referring to the ballerina skirt. There was one image with a lot of stripes. It was not clear what the y-axis of that image was. It was very small. X-axis was R.
Typically, it would be the y-axis would typically be the spin axis of the pulsar,
Spin axis.
and x-axis will be the equatorial plane, cut through the equatorial plane.
That is the current sheet.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So one last question is, I just checked the paper related to the slot gap. Unlike other papers, they have not given any, the double peak pulse in that paper. So I'm curious how that would translate. Will it give a similar peak as the other cases like outer gap or the caustic pole?
Slot gap will produce something which is very similar to outer gap, because the maximum part of the emission comes from the long part of the gap, which is similar to outer gap.
Okay.
But slot gap also includes something which is closer to the surface. So there is, the typical terminology for this is fan beam and pencil beam. So it may also have a little bit of pencil beam emission, as opposed to outer gap, which typically produces only fan beam emission.
Outer gap only fan beam. Okay.
Yes, because there's nothing coming from near the magnetic axis of the pulsar.
Okay. And sir, this is about your work in the your paper on multipoles, right? So that in that you had actually mentioned that the origin and evolution of the magnetic field of the pulsars are an open question. I think that was in '99. Like,
it is still an open question.
It is still an open question. Sir,
yes.
Why is that? Where is the blind spot which prevents us from learning that?
So you should join this effort and try to close it.
Sure, sir. But what is the difficulty basically?
Difficulty is that we cannot dig into a neutron star and find out what is there inside.
Oh.
So we have to infer too many things about the interior based on very few observables from outside. That's the main problem.
Has general relativity made any progress into that, or could it be the answer?
General relativity, to the extent it is important, is already taken into account.
Okay. Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to a question from the forum. So Abhay had posted, do we have some analytical description of the magnetic field in the Goldrich-Julian magnetosphere? Or is it one has to solve the pulsar equation numerically to get the value of the magnetic field?
Okay, so let me. Sorry. Can you read that question again? I couldn't.
Sure. The question is, do we have some analytical description of the magnetic field in the Goldrich-Julian magnetosphere? Or is it
yes.
that one has to solve the pulsar equation numerically?
Correct. Yeah, I saw that question before. Yeah, so the description of the magnetic field in a Goldrich-Julian magnetosphere, which is actually the force-free magnetosphere, there is no analytical solution for a dipole magnetosphere possible of the pulsar equation. The only way we can do it is by numerics, and that's what is being done now. So if you want to get a visualization of the magnetic field with all its distortions in the magnetosphere, best thing is to do is to look at the solutions of the numerical simulations. What Goldreich-Julian does is a local description. It does not have a global solution. And it does a lot of very good phenomenological arguments to give you a decent idea of how the field should look like. Like you will have a toroidal component. You can add the toroidal component to the poloidal component. But you know, when you add a toroidal component to the poloidal component, your total field is toroidal plus poloidal. And it is that total field which should now be used to solve your pulsar equation, which is not what is being done in Goldreich-Julian. So it is not fully self-consistent, but it's qualitatively very descriptive and very useful to fix our ideas on. But to really get an accurate description of what the magnetic field should look like in the force-free approximation, you should use the numerical simulations.
Okay, sir.
The next question was about current sheets in the outer gap region. So the question is, how does the current sheet play a role in the outer gap region? If the current sheet is present in the rotational equator of the star, won't it limit the outer gap extent to the equatorial plane, as the charges are not present elsewhere in the outer gap?
So we have to separate these two concepts, because the current sheets came when we started to do these global solutions of the magnetosphere. And then we now see what is the shape of the current sheet. Outside the light cylinder, it is equatorial, and then it follows the last open field lines all the way down to the stellar surface. We are not talking about outer gaps and so on here. Outer gaps came in earlier picture, Ruderman-Sutherland picture, with a Goldreich-Julian background. So now we do not talk about a simultaneous existence of a current sheet and outer gap. But what we can see is that inside the magnetosphere, that is inside the light cylinder, the shape of the current sheet very much follows what is expected of an outer gap, or rather even slot gap, because it goes all the way down to the stellar surface. So it doesn't make any sense to ask whether the current sheet is going to limit the outer gap or not, because we are not talking about both of them being existent in the same picture.
Sir, what I was confused was, we said that there are subsurface currents and they are getting completed through the current sheet. So I was thinking that the current sheet is ending up on the equator. So it's not the case. It is ending up on the polar gap itself, is it?
Yeah, so it is on the equator outside the light cylinder.
Okay.
And then it follows the last open field line and then ends up at the poles, right?
Okay, sir. Okay.
And there are two branches of it, ends up near the two poles, and then subsurface currents connect the two under the surface.
Okay.
You can look at the picture. I think it is there in my slides, as well as in Cerruti and Beloborodov, very clearly indicate where the current sheet is. It actually envelopes the closed magnetosphere.
I'll have a look at that.
Yeah.
So Abhay, you had other questions you wanted to ask?
Yes, sir.
You can directly ask.
In one of your first lectures, you mentioned about orthogonal polarization of BSR B2020 plus 28. and the polarization S curve switches to 90 degrees and then back to orthogonal. So I was wondering if this is a interesting research area to follow up with, and how does one go about it?
I mean, this has been known for a long time, and many pulsars have been seen to exhibit this. So you basically have two parallel S curves separated by 90 degrees, and a single subpulse will inhibit either one or the other. And there can be quick switches, there can be slow switches, but there is the existence of these two modes, and each mode following its own S curve, which are parallel to each other, has been established by from observations for quite a long while. How this orthogonal modes arise is still not fully understood, but there are some theoretical attempts to understand it. I mean, in one of the future lectures, you will get to hear a little bit of it. But that area is still not fully comprehensively addressed. So yes, so the plasma physics of the magnetosphere, details of it, which produces these orthogonal modes, and the polarization angle traverse and so on, I think is still fairly open. And if anyone is interested, that is a interesting area to pursue, but it's obviously not an easy area to pursue, because many people have been trying this for a long time. It's complex. It's a rather complex behavior of the magnetosphere has to be taken into account. But it is an open question still, to some extent.
Okay, sir. I was also wondering about the distances to the pulsars and how the refractive index changing in the ISM affects those distances. So, do we have?
So distances to the pulsars are determined through various things. Most common is the dispersion measure. But you know that dispersion measure scale itself had to be calibrated. So dispersion measure is nothing but the line of sight column density of free electrons, thermal free electrons. So we have to know a priori what is the density of thermal free electrons in the line of sight. So to do that, other measurements have been used. For example, for very nearby pulsars, parallax can be used, which has a very good accuracy of distance measurement and accuracy and reliability. For somewhat more distant pulsars, the neutral hydrogen absorption by neutral hydrogen in our galaxy has been used to measure the distances. And then you compare the dispersion measure, compare these other values of distances, and then you make a model of electron density distribution in the galaxy. These other distance measurements include, for example, globular clusters, where optical methods are used to establish the distance. And then you have a pulsar in it, you measure dispersion measure. So all of these have gone into making the model of the electron density distribution in the galaxy. Now, this model is accurate only to a certain extent. I mean, the distances can be off in specific directions by even a factor of 2 or something. So it has to be taken with that point of view.
Okay, sir. Yeah. Sir, has it been the case that there are some binary coalescing stars? They could either be normal stars or neutron stars. And they show a pulsed emission which is similar to the pulsar. So we may have not resolved their pulsed emission. So I mean, does it overlap with the signature of a pulsar sometimes? The pulses by the binaries.
No, are you talking about whether a binary system can produce a signature which is similar to
Yes, sir.
an isolated pulsar? Is that
Yes.
your question?
Yes, and then we could probably mix it up. Has it been like that, or they are very distinguishable?
Yeah, I think they are quite distinguishable. Let's not talk about coalescing binaries. Coalescing binaries last for a very short time, and then there is no long-term steady effect that results from it.
Okay.
But binary systems in general, their time periods will be long. Not like a, see, even if you take a very close binary system, which has a significant lifetime, that orbital period will typically be in minutes at best, not shorter than that.
Okay. Okay.
Right? Now, here you're talking about seconds to milliseconds. It's difficult to produce that from binaries. Although, yes, just before coalescence, you might have such short periods, but then you will not have anything which is long-lived. It will coalesce and it will disappear.
Right. Okay.
That's one thing. And there are other reasons why you can distinguish between binaries and a single object producing this. So yes, I think the fact that these are neutron stars that we normally talk about in general are due to spin and not binary periods is fairly well established.
Okay, sir. One last question is that can we develop one laboratory setup where we have a high powerful magnet and let's say a cylindrical bar magnet, and we make it rotate also at high speed? That should be a possibility, and generate an electron positron plasma around it. So will it show some kind of behavior? Can that be simulated in the laboratory? That is similar to pulsar, not
Okay,
exactly, but
so this is an exercise you can do on the back of the envelope as to if you're trying to do a scaled down version of the pulsar magnetosphere. What
yes.
processes do you want to reproduce? Is it pair production that you want to reproduce? Is it acceleration that you want to reproduce? Is it radiation that you want to reproduce? For each of these,
yeah.
No. So you want to reproduce the magnetosphere.
Yeah.
But what aspect of magnetosphere? You'll have to fill it with charges and then you look at the charge distribution in the magnetosphere.
Yeah, and the possibility
Is that what
of
you want to do?
movements of currents and whether they will emit certain radiations like that.
Yeah, for each of these things, as I was saying, the various aspects of this you are trying to reproduce. You can look at the numbers in the pulsar magnetosphere and then see whether your scaled experiment reproduces those essential numbers, right? So if you can reproduce that scale, then you should see a similar physical phenomenon. The question is it possible to reproduce that scale in the lab? I don't think so, but this is not an exercise I've done myself on paper. So, but this is something you can do. You can just take, let's say you want to reproduce pair production. You can take strength of bar magnet that you can find in the lab, and then see how fast you have to rotate it to produce the correct condition for the for enough acceleration and pair production, right? And then see whether that is realizable or not.
Yeah, even the pulsar with everything else being in place fails to pass some of these tests of having enough appropriate condition for producing pairs, and that's when it will ends up in the graveyard. So you can see that those combinations are very important.
Yeah.
there's some threshold that you need to cross before any other action can take place.
That's correct. My gut feeling is it's going to be extremely hard to come up with laboratory numbers where you can reproduce this. But I've not done this sum myself, but this is a homework problem you can do. Okay. Other questions, Prakash?
Not from the forum. If anyone has a question, you should unmute yourself and ask.
Sir, just one small question. Like, we have discussed all the different models like outer gap, caustic poles, striped wind. So one thing is like these things are different ideas, but one thing is clear. Can we say that the Goldrich-Julian is sacrosanct in general in pulsars?
No, Goldrich-Julian is a very good guide of what goes on in the pulsar magnetosphere. But as I've repeated time and again, Goldrich-Julian is not a fully self-consistent solution. So to be able to do that, you have to properly close all the equations with appropriate boundary conditions. And that is only now possible with the numerical simulations. Until then, these are all piecemeal solutions. And so the Goldrich-Julian is not a sacrosanct model in that sense, but it is an excellent description, qualitative description of what goes on in pulsars.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
It's almost towards the end. Any last question?
Yeah, I just have a comment from the last aspect.
Yeah.
Fortunately, this what I call a part-time pulsar, which was Kramer and collaborators' observation of this long nuller,
yes,
which is active for a week and then off for a couple of weeks and so on, provided the slowdown rate contributed by or slowdown that is contributed or breaks contributed by the particle flows. And naturally the current densities associated with this with guidance from Goldrich-Julian came into explicit discussion, and I think their estimates matched to the decimal place of what Goldrich-Julian would have predicted, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
If I can comment on this, the pulsar that Desh has talked about. So there are other nulling pulsars in which they tried undertaking the same calculation, and that didn't happen. I mean, this is remarkable in this particular pulsar, but this feature didn't show up in a few other nulling pulsars they tried to check if this works.
I mean, they have long nulls because
yeah, not probably not intermittent pulsar, not
right.
as long nulls as these.
Because I think here the equation is pretty clean. That
yes, but I will dig up the reference and can share it.
Yeah, that will be interesting. I will be interested.
So, so that it's not as clear as it appeared from the case of this particular pulsar.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, what exactly do they calculate in these? Desh?
No. See, the energy loss rate that you actually observe in addition to the dipole radiation related loss, right? And that opportunity was presented by this pulsar, which gave you a reference energy loss, which is happening even when it's not, the action that is required for radio radiation is there. So they compared and blaming all the extra loss of extra rate that they saw of energy loss, blaming it on the particle flow, right? And then they can work backwards with certain assumptions, I guess, and see how that relates to the current density required for that to happen. And then they natural comparison is possible. The Julian, and I think that's where they saw that the match was pretty good. That prediction will come from the field strength and so on and so forth. I hope in doing so, I hope they did the correct thing, because the field is estimated from assuming energy loss is entirely due to magnetic dipole radiation.
Yeah.
Right? So it's always overestimated.
There could be a circular argument there.
Yeah.
But,
so I do not know whether they, they took care of that. I should look into this. I was certainly attracted to this comparison and that it was found to be pretty satisfactory to begin with. But as Sushant said, I should also look at how the other comparisons look like.
Yeah. So how the spin down rate goes as a function of magnetic field and so on. Now, from the numerical simulations where fully consistent boundary conditions are taken into account, but with force-free assumption, that has so that can be computed from these models, and they show a behavior which is pretty similar to Goldreich-Julian, but there is a factor in front which might make you overestimate or underestimate the magnetic field depending on the angle between the magnetic axis and the spin axis. But otherwise, the dependencies are quite similar. So therefore, once you have fixed that factor, which would not change for one pulsar in any case, so you have some measure of effective magnetic field, then you have to go along with it unless you have a independent measure like cyclotron line or something like that. Otherwise, it is very difficult to figure out what the intrinsic magnetic field is.
Right. So one should see, Sushant, in these other cases where the combination of inclination and the field, that is at least robustly connecting with the estimates that come from observations.
Yeah.
Desh, I had a quick look trying to pull out the reference. What I have quickly found is that what people, Young et al. Reported, they have tracked B0823 plus 26, and they have observed no change in the spin down rate for the pulsar between off state and the on state.
All right.
So, which means that if we attribute the change in the spin down rate in Kramer's pulsar for this magnetospheric emission is not there, everything is particle emissions, so that would not work. So if there is no change in the spin down rate, so whatever mechanism is active during the on state is still active in the off state.
Yeah, I mean, I will have to look at that because is it like the nulls, very clear cut variations versus what is called a null state or off state?
Yeah, so no, this part of course I do not know very well, but this is what they have stated. I haven't gone into the details of the paper. Yes,
I think the relative contributions would also depend on. I have to look at what the dependencies are for the dipole radiation versus energy loss through particle flow. But it wouldn't surprise me if it's if they are different, and then based on the parameters of the pulsar, the relative proportions might be different. And to what accuracy they're making a statement of no change in that.
Yeah, right. So there might be many factors which I do not know about.
But see, I think right from the beginning, one knew that there is a, I mean, you invoke everything wanting to, have this particle flow. You require coherence, so you have to have them, right? And so after having all this, you were never asked, what are the other implications of it. And that they will slow down is also recognized by several people, even in the context of, I think, as Deepankar mentioned, in the context of the torque that might, counter align or something, right? So with all that, that they can play important role energetically. One had not accounted for that in any easy way while estimating magnetic fields from the slow down rate, right? Which naively assumed that it's all due to the dipole radiation. So somebody should revise those magnetic field estimates anyway.
But there is a argument for that. Even the even the spin down torque due to dipole radiation. Yeah, so even the spin down torque due to dipole radiation has the same dimensional dependence on the field and the spin rate. There are factors which are different, but since the dimensional dependence is the same, so other than some numerical coefficients, it will be very difficult to figure out whether it is due to dipole radiation or due to particle wind.
When you're talking about dipole radiation, you're talking about the emission or the frequency of rotation.
That is correct.
But that never makes it out, right?
That never makes it out. But in the early models of pulsars, it was thought that that is the main energy carrier, which then dumps its energy into particles and then but we know that is a picture. That's not really the case. Oh. So dipole is the pulsar.
Okay, I think we should end it here today and then meet next week. Okay, thanks everyone for joining.